So at this time, I'd like to actually invite up Dr. Jamie Austin, as well as those who are going to be participating in this next session. Dr. Austin will moderate the report outs on the novel collaborations and partnerships breakout sessions. And for those of you who may not know Jamie, which I doubt is many in this room, Jamie is a senior research scientist here at the University of Texas at the Institute for Geophysics, and a seismic stratigrapher who has worked on both passive and convergent sedimented continental margins around the world with colleagues and students since the late 1970s. Jamie was chair of the International Ocean Discovery Forum from 2015 to 2017, associate director of the UT Institute of Geophysics from 2012 to 2017, but he was also been integral to the success of the NOAA Ocean Exploration Program through its entire life, having served on the Ocean Exploration Advisory Working Group and later the Ocean Exploration Advisory Board, before rotating off of those roles to serve on an Intergovernmental Personnel Act assignment with NOAA Ocean Exploration, which he continues to this day, and in which he has been working closely with NOAA Ocean Exploration as well as the Consortium of Ocean Leadership staff over the last year to plan and coordinate this very event. So, for which Jamie is also a generous sponsor. So please join me in welcoming Jamie to the stage, and thank you, Jamie, for all that you've done to get us here over the past, well, what is greater than a year now at this point. We look forward to the conversation.
I told some people last night, 300 Zoom calls we figured to get ready for this, give or take. Well, good morning, everybody. It's my pleasure to usher in the next phase of the agenda. And so here's the way this is going to play. We have 5 representatives of the 5 breakout group co-leads up here. They're going to introduce themselves briefly, and then we're going to have about 15 minutes where they discuss among themselves the synergies and overlaps that occurred, and they've done a little briefing among themselves for that this morning. And then we'll open it up for Q&A for 15 minutes or so, both from the audience and from our virtual attendees. Okay, so we'll start over there. Go ahead and introduce yourselves.
I'm Allison Miller. I co-led Breakout Group D.
I'm Suraya Nanyas James, and I did Group A. Hi, I'm Jill Burke. I'm with the U.S. Geological Survey. I did Breakout Group B.
Millie Pitts, Group Breakout E with Jill Zandy.
Hi, everyone. I'm Simone Barkley, and I was in I did the same thing you did, Breakout Group C.
So what I thought we'd do, and you know, it's these are always interesting conversations, but what I thought I would kick out is if among yourselves this morning, and feel free, co-leads out there in the audience, if you want to chime in, do it. Did you see a synergy? And so we're going to do this for the next 15 or so minutes, and then I'll talk about overlaps. So want to chime in? I'm not going to point at people.
Yeah, I think collaborations and partnerships always start and center around people, and that's where a lot of the discussion centered in our group, and there was certainly overlap with who we need to collaborate in partnership with and how the people are important to each of those partnerships.
I'll comment. So the people part that we talked about particularly were the stakeholders. If you talk about societal needs, it's hard to really do that unless you talk to people in society, right? Get their input. Understanding there's going to be a lot of tension of everyone won't agree on what these needs are. There's going to be a need for compromise. And regional differences as well. We're a big country. The EEZ is a huge area.
Anyone else?
Well, another one that I'd like to point out is that there was a lot of conversation around public engagement and education and outreach, and those efforts not being put, you know, on the back end, but that there needs to be funding for those things up front, and those should not be efforts that we try to figure out, you know, like after we've already, you know, put plans together, as you all are talking about partnerships.
To chime in a little bit with that, we also, the data as well, doing that on the front end, making sure there's funding for data management and the long-term provenance of the data and where it's going.
And just to go off of what Simone had said, that those partnerships should be intentional. So it's kind of what's reflecting on what she said, especially with Indigenous communities and the communities that already have ownership of that. So, you know, how do we do that? And that's really, it begins at the beginning, not an afterthought. So.
Yeah, that was kind of a final message in ours too, was that no matter who you're partnering with, that the data, the Indigenous communities and other communities that you're working with and the public outreach cannot be an afterthought or come after the research expedition, but they need to be interwoven in and included in the planning of the process.
We ran prior to the forum, there was another long-term effort at doing a Pacific Priorities workshop, which is now online at the COL website. And the idea that diversity and related was based on relations, building relationships over the long term, pre, during, post expeditions. And we have some great examples of that being done effectively. Ocean Exploration Trust, for example, already in the Pacific, rather than transactional relationships. Any other synergies that came to mind?
I mean, our group also talked about, workforce development and getting young professionals into the workforce. And this is something that we heard yesterday too, right? Folks asking about early career professionals or young people. And a lot of the things that my group discussed was having some like true pathways into the ocean exploration workforce. And that could be tapping into groups of folks that we don't traditionally look at, right? So that could mean, it could be people who maybe have, I'm gonna be candid and say something that was shared in our group. So someone shared that they have dyslexia, but that they think that it helped them to become a really great ocean explorer. And so looking at people, again, not what you typically might think of, folks who have gone the traditional pathways through school. The person who shared this in our group talked a lot about how they made it despite, like school was hard for them, right? And they pushed through. And we should be looking at people who maybe don't have the traditional pathways that we have put in on paper as what you need as these requirements to go into this field. A lot of times, sometimes those requirements aren't actually required, right? We just think that they are because it's been done that way for so long.
And then our group discussed quite a bit, even within kind of the more traditional methods, but embedding industry and federal partners in the front end. So like, with the high school students, with the undergrads, to have more synergy, that there are different outlets to take their career to, and to build those partnerships earlier on in someone's career than you suddenly, later on, how do I build these partnerships?
Yeah, we had, it's a little bit for both, but I think it was more looking at early career professionals and then really looking at how we incorporate that science communication aspect and that outreach aspect into their actual curriculum and training as they're going through that. Because I know I recently had a conversation and that was one of the biggest things, like, well, we don't have time, scientists don't have time. I understand that, but at the same time, these scientists will eventually have to talk. If you don't talk to kids, you're gonna have to talk to managers. You're gonna have to talk to somebody. So changing that culture of how making science communication and outreach important, even if it's an actual class they must take to complete their graduate work in some form. So that starts to change the narrative as they come into the work field. It's not something they have to think about afterwards. It's something they've already incorporated into everything that they do. And I know, I don't know, Dr. Pollack is here. She mentioned that a lot of her graduate students want to do this. They want to teach, they want to do outreach, but they just don't know how to do that and they don't know their place in that. And so there's already a need. Like, if you're listening, there's a need for that already. It's not something that they're not going to want to do. There's a want already.
Yeah, we had a little different conversation about partnerships. I agree with everything. We thought the partnerships could also be a route to making this whole process more durable and less susceptible to changes of personnel at NOAA or in the White House or other key federal agencies. And if people are embedded and you reach the young people, at an earlier stage, and you're reaching people all through industry and academia, it's very difficult then to unplug some of it. It makes it kind of sticky and more durable.
Yeah, it strikes me. I was just looking at the title of this breakout session, and I think for the first time I looked at the word novel, and I found myself thinking about it. And as you were talking about how scientists have to change their behavior here, one of our biggest obstacles in academia is that academia has had the same rubrics for success since the Renaissance. And if we can change, next year I will have been a scientist in the business for 50 years. The rubrics for my success haven't changed very much until I got involved in ocean exploration and engaged in telepresence and reached out to people who weren't scientists and realized I had to change the entire focus of my conversations, not dealing with colleagues, but dealing with 8th graders, dealing with retired people online, as I was looking at an image of the seafloor. And I realized this is as much a learning experience for me as it is for them. And I think if we can, as a goal in science, reach out more than we have, then we're going to attract young people in ways we never have. And boy, is that novel. That would change things. And it would also lead to durability. So were there substantive overlaps? I mean, I heard the word trust a little bit in the white paper discussion yesterday, and trust is a big deal. You earn it, you lose it fast. I heard all those things. Did you talk much about the role of trust in these?
We did storytelling. I think there's a couple of overlap with what is the narrative, what is the story, and then how that really translates to who the audience is and what's the story they have to tell, what's the narrative. But I think I saw it in other folks as we were putting it up on the board. So if anybody wants to chime in on that as well.
We talked about accountability, and there's little trust, I think, without accountability ultimately, right? And so while one will have a very wide opening to talk to stakeholders, very broad, at some point, someone has to own this process that's going to be mapped out. And we use the phrase that if everyone owns it, no one owns it, right? I mean, everyone can't be accountable. And there was some conversation that we would hope or recommend or want NOAA and others to think about what I'm going to call put a white sheet of paper down and not have a reflexive or default who owns this, and really think about the best way that this process is owned.
On the very micro level, we talked about trust even within our breakout session. So we spoke about, have we established trust just within our session to be able to speak freely? And I think that's a really micro example of how you need to establish trust before you can engage in these partnerships and feel like you can speak and work freely within any community. But within our breakout session, it was a really small example of that.
I mean, we talked about being uncomfortable yesterday a lot. And I think one of the reasons we decided to mix and match participants in breakout groups over the couple of days was exactly that.
Yeah.
We didn't want groups getting comfortable with each other. We wanted different, in quote, stakeholders, different participants to be in rooms, keep the leaders the same. We needed that for continuity, but have the groups be different in order to get us used to that, dealing with each other in new ways. Anything else?
I think there.
Sorry, go ahead.
We had, and I'll read exactly what we wrote. We had generalized partnership framework that can apply broadly in different entities that can establish a mutual value of the partnership. And then I know I had to ask Armand to kind of clarify a little bit about what we were doing. I don't know if we're asking the audience already, but because I think he really we captured it in this area, and maybe you can correct me, Armand, okay, if I misuse your words, really being comfortable with those partnerships, but also understanding that if there are truly novel partnerships, that there is going to be, we have the trust, but we also have the understanding that we have to be comfortable with navigating through that if it hasn't been done before. Like, are you going to be open? Well, I've never done that. We tend to be in our silos, right? We wanted the partners that we always have. We want the people that we always work with. But if we truly want to change and even explore ourselves, right, in what we're trying to do here, is that to be really open to, when I tell my students all the time, right, you have to be open to fail. That's just part of it. If it doesn't work, then it doesn't work. You try to figure out what happens, go through that process. It's really your first attempt in learning. That's what I tell them. That's, get used to it, because that's really life. I'm like a hard teacher, I guess. But really just, that's part of what we need to do here. We need to be open to, it may not always go right. We're gonna bump heads, but that's part of the process if we really want to have that partnership and those novel partnerships. Simone?
Yeah, and while like there is definitely best practices for partnerships and partnership engagement, I think to your point about novel partnerships, we also need to look at them like individualistically too, right? Like sometimes the partner that you're working with, you may not be able to approach that partnership or engage in that partnership the same way you do another. That group may come from a different background. They may have other priorities. And I think that a lot of times we think that the processes need to be exactly the same. And so, you know, the timeline needs to be the same, or, you know, the steps that we have to take. You have to also think about like, you know, what resources does the group that you're working with have? Like they may not have the same resource that another group that you've worked with us, or the same knowledge, right? Or any of those things. And so we need to look at those things a bit differently, I think. And it seems like we've done a lot of work around, you know, saying that we want to engage different groups and we want to be inclusive. But when there are like hurdles with those groups, we're like, oh, well, it's too hard to work here, right? You know, it's too much to work here. Like, no, it's not too hard. It's not too much. Like you need to be patient. We need to be respectful. And I think that those things are really important.
Jerry Schubel, many of you know him. That first forum, he used the word unpredictable. You know, we were meeting at a public venue, the Aquarium of the Pacific. The public was there, and we had a chance to interact with them to a degree, some of us, and the word unpredictable came up. And it strikes me that as we're dealing with this now, novel could also mean unpredictable. And unpredictable, uncomfortable isn't something that humans, we don't do it very well. We all live with what we can control, the spaces we're comfortable in. How do we deal with unpredictability? I mean, partnerships are supposed to, if they're durable, they last. And so what are your feelings about unpredictability?
We didn't talk about unpredictability in that exact sense, but we did talk about the importance of, even when you're partnering, good communication, the importance of someone that's going to kind of lead the group and keep everyone on the same page. So even if it's a two-way collaboration, you still need someone that's willing to be a little bit of a leader and take responsibility and guide the group. And then just within this community, even if we're uncomfortable and we're doing different things, just the importance of letting everyone know what you're doing, what your strengths are, what's going on, so that we're still not recreating the wheel, even in those novel times when we're trying new things.
We didn't use the word directly, but I think it was in the back of our mind, and we did a quick dive into space exploration. So I think the use of case studies to compare and see what's happened in other verticals or with other processes. Now, one can argue that space exploration in its infancy, you know, in the 60s and 70s, even in the 80s, was driven by a lot of national security interests. This is going to be driven by other things, perhaps what the administrator said yesterday and Jerry said today about climate and blue economy and so forth.
I think there is a growing recognition that if we don't pay attention to the oceans, national security is a big deal.
Well, that's true. So it may also be, but I think case studies are, in some ways, they're comforting, and I think they help people, humans, overcome their fear of the unpredictability.
We heard the term storytelling a little bit in our breakout group. It's something that the Ocean Exploration Advisory Board, we've been talking about storytelling. OE as a program is 20 years old. We've been talking about, I've been involved for 18 of those 20. And we've been talking about storytelling the whole time. We talk about data, we talk about public engagement, telepresence, but did you talk much about storytelling? I know we did in our breakout group.
Our group did as well. Our case in point was looking at the various streaming, because it's one of the big ways of getting people to see what's there. But really, the things that people latch on to are the ones where there is a human element. You get people, posting clips where it's a reaction to seeing something really awesome. So getting that storytelling into some of these things that we've already got out there to provide that human element to really actually connect with people, not just looking at the seafloor, but saying something about it and what it means to them.
We talked about engaging with pop culture, kind of going back to Carly's presentation. It's not always me telling you a story one-on-one, but engaging with the storytellers that do that well in different media, the video game creators or the cartoon and TV show creators, telling them the story and then letting them interpret it into pop culture and having it reach a lot more people than we ever could just one-on-one or in small groups, and expanding how we tell our story to those audiences.
I mean, Garrett's video yesterday was all about somebody who lives in an entirely different universe,
Exactly.
looking at ROVs and recognizing, wow, this is a video game. I could do this. And as a white man of a certain age, I don't do social media very much, but when you deal with students in their 20s, if you're not dealing with social media, your ship's passing far away in the night. So I agree with you completely. I mean, this is really important. Others?
I think we talked more about funding, the fact that, especially when we looked at data acquisition and analysis, but no real funding to disseminate and really tell that story of what it's saying or anything after that, right? You acquire it, you post it, but no training on how to educate people on it, who's using it. It's just getting data and analyzing it. So what, the real challenge of having that specific funding so that we can do the storytelling and the narrative.
Our group touched on that as well. Yeah, funding both to, if the scientists aren't yet trained to it, at least in the interim, make sure there's funding for the people who can tell those stories, and then down the line, but funding for both the scientists and the storytellers to get the story out there. So yeah, funding was a big key for us as well.
We didn't talk about the platform or the funding. We talked about more the content of what the stories could be. Successful partnerships that show that we can do it, right? And someone in our group wanted this whole thing to have a very optimistic feel to it, that this is something we can do. We've done it before, maybe not in the same organized effort. And we listed some of the successful partnerships that are going on right now.
I definitely think storytelling is important. It is centered around a lot of the work that I do. And I think that it is absolutely true that, we can put it out there as much as we want to, but that doesn't mean that people are going to see it or engage with it or know what it is. And so the funding piece, I think, is extremely important. And looking again at the way that we go about engaging with different communities or groups, when we are putting out, whatever the piece is, that it could be a video game, it could be, the things on Instagram or TikTok or whatever. Social media is definitely very powerful. There are a lot of times on Twitter, I even see a viral, which doesn't really mean a whole lot nowadays, because people can go viral like this and then it could be forgotten the next day, right? I see tons of pictures of creatures from many of the expeditions that a lot of these that we're talking about here. I see those photos all the time that go viral, and people who are not in the ocean community whatsoever see it and they relate it to whatever is interesting to them, right? Like, oh, this looks like an alien or whatever, and they think that's really cool. But because there's nothing else connected to it after that, then they get disengaged. So we know that there's interest. We know that people get excited about it. We know that they want to know more, but then there's no more for them to find out, right? Like that piece is just a photo. So I definitely think that we should be working a lot more on how we move forward with telling the stories and making sure that if people want to know more, where's the one location where they can go to find out more? Because it's hard if people are pulled in different directions too.
I got one more question, and then we're going to transition to a Q&A from you and our virtual audience. You know, we talk about novel collaborations and partnerships. And when we had our myriad Zoom meetings on the way to this, we were talking about collaborations perhaps as a base, and then leading to partnerships which might be a little more organized, and then leading ultimately to alliances. We didn't talk so much about resources, but we thought this might be a graduated process. Did any of you, your groups, talk about the difference between collaborations and partnerships? Or did you use them interchangeably?
For the purpose, excuse me, I think for the purpose of our 90 minutes, we use them interchangeably. Yeah.
That's good. Okay, what I think we'll do now, and I'm going to give our COL colleagues a chance to get microphones around. If you want to ask a question out there, raise your hand, and periodically, and we'll do that. We're going to do what we did yesterday. We're going to alternate. If we have questions from our virtual attendees, we'll have one of them come on screen and ask it, and then we'll alternate it with somebody here. And while they're getting organized to that, I wanted to just give a couple of minutes. We have Alan mentioned it, we have a large range of experience here with this activity. OE as an organized program started in 2002 with a presidential commission. Dr. Ballard was on it. The idea was to have a national program, and we've circled around to a national program 20 years later with multi-agency support. This was in 2002, and the idea at that time was to have $75 million allocated to ocean exploration. It's 20 years ago. Well, that would be more than double that amount now, given the state of the dollar over time. And only NOAA stepped forward as the agency to run things. And here we are back 20 years later to a notion that we have to have more support beyond NOAA with other federal agencies and with other partners and stakeholders for a real national program to take place. We've had multiple forums through the years. A community assessment was mandated by the legislation that set up the national OE program. The idea was to do it approximately annually. We haven't had one annually. This is the first one in a couple of years. But I think we have a real opportunity with this one, because I'm a resource guy. I have to write contracts and grants for a living. I think with the NOMEC, the National Initiative to Map, Explore, and Characterize the US EEZ, with the Seabed 2030, with the UN Decade, we have a chance to put aspirations together with resources to make OE bigger than it has been. As successful as it's been historically underfunded. We've gone up and down on the waves, but it's always been underfunded, always. I think we could change that, and I think this report will go a distance towards making that happen. I certainly hope so. So a question from the audience, and the spotlight's right in my eyes. So go ahead and ask if you have a microphone. And please identify yourself for us if you would.
Okay, hi, I'm Maggie Peacock. I'm an undergrad student at A&M Corpus Christi, and then I'm also board of directors member for Gulf Reach Institute and the co-director of youth engagement. And I know we were talking a lot about like trust and accountability, especially like with involving young people. But if we're making 5 to 10 year plans, how are we actually going to like hold NOAA accountable and making sure that not only young people are represented, but young people from underserved communities are being here and they're represented in these discussions? Because there's a lot of talk about it, but how are we going to make those plans and hold NOAA accountable?
Wow, accountable. That's always a scary word for me, but so I'm not going to take it. I'm going to let them.
I think I'll start. I think you said something, Jamie, that was you said there's funding coming through and that traditionally it's been underfunded. Well, we understand, some of us understand that there's groups that are even more underfunded. So really, again, being intentional about where those funds are going. And that they're being allocated to those groups that traditionally don't even get anything. So is this funding, and so to you, Maggie, is the funding going to go to the same people it's gone to forever? Or is it going to go to those novel partnerships and new people and new faces and new bodies so that we can engage young people, et cetera. I mean, you asked me that question about GRI, how I get funded. I'm like, I have no funding right now. Like, you have my team. But so I think I'm going to end it there. So I don't want to take up too much space right now.
I can add a little bit. We actually talked about more support for the teachers and educators, bringing them on board and having them participate in ocean exploration, not to discount the focus on youth at all, but like you said, in 5 or 10 years, those youth grow up, obviously. And so if you can give a teacher an opportunity or give a teacher more resources, that can actually go maybe a longer way in the community, because they'll take that experience and use it over and over again with more kids. So not to say that that's a correct approach, but that's what our breakout session discussed.
I'm very simple. I think you write it down, it becomes a KPI internally, and someone has to answer to that KPI, and it's in writing, and those are public. And so, yes, then you can stand up and say, you wrote this down in 2022 and you haven't done it. Or yes, you've done it, and hooray, and thank you.
We talked about accountability more in terms of the data for societal needs, but yeah, you know, that the funding agencies, that, yeah, there are actual metrics and that they have to be followed through on, that there is some sort of enforcement in getting whatever the milestones are into the project, so that people have to do them. But in terms of reaching the communities, we talked more about reaching the informal educators and getting into more the community settings. So one example was like the YMCA. So getting funding into the places where you're going to insert the message into the families and have it be intergenerational and not just in the formal setting.
Yeah, we talked about that. Also.
Yeah.
Yeah, I echo that.
So something.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm an educator, and I think that this is really important. And, you know, talking about the YMCA, right? That's a great example. I think that we also have to realize and recognize, like, it's not enough to like make the announcement that this is happening, right? Or it's not enough to say like, hey, this is something we sent out an email, right? Or we posted this on this board, right? I don't think that that's enough. I think that we definitely have to do more and go to the groups and ask, you know, this is the opportunity. Why do we want you here? What would you being here? You know, like, how would that benefit us, right? Because I don't want to come to something if I don't know what I'm getting out of it. Like, I don't really see why I would go. I think it would be also important to make sure that, I mean, I know this is a conversation that we've heard over and over, but especially for communities that have typically been left out of conversations, and we know that funding is an issue, like, so you need to incentivize people, right? Like, you need to also think about like paying people for their time if they're going to be doing work there. Like, if you're going to ask folks to be contributing something that is significant, I think that they should be compensated. No, pay inequities have plagued these communities for so long, and it's not okay and it's not fair. And I think that we should be recognizing that we need to think about these things a little bit differently, because you know, we need everyone's voice. Like, there's no way that we can move forward without it. So yes, absolutely, for the youth being there, and definitely for teachers being a part of the conversation. And I was happy to hear yesterday even that, you know, in one of the panels, it was mentioned that educators should be invited here. And I mean, I have not explored the ocean, or I'm not someone who would consider myself like in this particular realm of marine science, but I didn't know about this forum, right? And I think that, again, that goes back to making sure that people know what's out there. They know what opportunities there are for them to be a part of conversations, to be a part of the work as we move forward.
I will say this, I've been involved, as I said, for 18 years in OE, and a lot of the conversations that have been very prominently taking place here were not taking place when we started. You know, we've always talked about stakeholders. We've always talked about partners. If you look back at one of the read aheads are the previous input items from previous forums, we've talked about a lot of this stuff before, but we haven't inserted relational interactions with indigenous groups. We haven't played diversity, equity, and inclusion the way we're playing it now, very importantly. And we certainly haven't talked about storytelling and involving beyond the data, beyond the scientific activity of exploring. We haven't done that the way we're doing that here. And I think that presents opportunities for us, again, for resources. So have we got a virtual question, Dan?
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. So we have a question from Jeff Herder, who's with the New York Department of State, Office of Planning and Development, which is responsible for administering the federally approved coastal management program. And Jeff asks and comments, what are the panel's or audience's thoughts on how to implement planning for outreach up front? He says, I'm kicking off a major overhaul of our publicly available geospatial portal in 2 weeks with an all-day planning and brainstorming session, focusing on the upgrades and functional improvements. But it sounds like we should plan for the outreach first. So how do we do that? And I think this is looking to tie the accessibility and availability of data to the public front.
I think we've talked a bit about it, but it's certainly, we've had endless conversations. We tend to use education and outreach as being linked, but in another major program I'm involved in, we've de-linked them. I think the education, involvement of teachers, planning of lesson plans and so on, and outreach, which is all of the spectrum of activities of dealing with the public, are actually really different. And so, but comments from any of you on that?
Yeah. I was just going to say kudos to realizing you need to do it before you start the project. I think we've talked about that a little bit, but one step ahead just for doing that. I think developing partnerships before you even write the plan down is great. I come from more of a data perspective than from an outreach perspective. And so creating a data management plan and knowing all the data that will be created during the project and how it will be shared is a great start from the data perspective. And I'll let others talk more about the outreach.
I think if you're going to do the outreach component, you're looking at, even as a PhD student, we had, when we were collecting our data, they did a really good job of just asking us, like, what do you even intend to do with this? So we had to start with the why in mind and the end product in mind, and not necessarily like, this is everything I'm going to do and how I'm going to do it. But okay, that's amazing, but what are you going to do with it? And so that's where that outreach component, and I think we've reiterated on this panel how important that is, because you have all of these things. Do you have an educator? It depends on the grant, right? Do you have an educator? Do you have a science communicator on board? Do you have somebody who knows, who is a professional, right? A teacher, teachers are professionals as well, that knows how to do this, that if you create something that it's actually going to be used. I don't know how many times we've had lessons and I'm like, we can't do that in the class, it doesn't work. But unless you ask the person who's actually using it, then you're never gonna know. You can't assume anything. And I think that's the outreach part in anything. It's not just in the schools. And just a quick comment, when you said we haven't had this conversation, I was surprised because, like Simone said, this is the first time that I'm not new necessarily to ocean exploration because I do some PD for teachers, but I'm new to this forum and I had never heard of this forum before until I got an email. But I was actually surprised to see the first forum had students involved in there. And
I will say we, the Ballard operation, the Ocean Exploration Trust operation, Ballard's an explorationist, but he's also in the infotainment business, and that's the term he uses. His audience, I introduced him to the 75th anniversary of Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. He and I were students there in the 70s. He had a row of seats that were vacant, and it was a packed house. And I said, Bob, all these empty seats, 8th graders and their parents coming in, and the kids, his favorite picture that he shows is a 5th, 6th grader with her mouth just open wide like this when he's showing slides about ocean exploration. So we've had real bright spots of reaching out, but we don't do it across the board as well as we should. And that's what I meant. I mean, I think we've just got to build it in structurally to everything we do now. Relationship with Indigenous people, underrepresented groups, whatever terms we want, and allocating resources. People don't work for nothing. I'm a resource person. I am here because I want to see us generate resources based on this kind of interaction. And I think that's a little bit different from the forums that have gone before. And I think Jerry's right. We're running out of time. Beaches will be scrunched. The public is recognizing that, and I think we've got to now see the urgency of what we're doing. But not forget the wonder and the wisdom about it. We can't sell threats. We've got to sell the wonder, or we'll never engage the next generation, ever. When a rover crosses Mars, they're playing the wonder card. And we've got to play the wonder card too. It's really important. Any other comments? And then we'll get another question. Okay, somebody in the house.
Hi there. Oh, wow. Daniel Kleinman, Seaworthy Collective. I also was a co-lead with Simone for Group C. And I think this really just jumped right off of some of the point that came up in our conversation about intentionality. When we talk about especially bringing in the youth and doing outreach, what does it actually mean? I'll throw it to you guys to answer. What does it actually mean to be intentional in reaching groups that we actually want to see here, right? And having the representation we're looking for when we talk about youth engagement, yet, there's probably less than 10 of us under 30 here, right? So what does it actually look like, from accountability to representation and accessibility of opportunity?
Another virtual question, Dan.
Is that the question?
That was more of a comment than a question, I would say.
Yeah, I would just add, I think it goes back to our online question, being really diligent and planning and creating before you step into the ocean, to say, and just doing those things before the exploration or the expedition begins.
And I think also, Armand's, he's got his hand up too. If you're talking about intentionality, I mean, look at your boards. Do they have young people on them? And do those positions on the board have power to have influence on the outcomes of whatever programs you have or goals that you have, like actual influence? So, I use Maggie and Armand because they're helping me a lot. I can tell you that much. I'm just on Facebook, so FYI. But they're the ones that kind of brought, I wanted them online with me, but at the same time, they're educating me on a lot of the things that really need to be done. But, if you're looking at diversity too, I've had lots of conversations about this. If I apply for something or apply for a job, I look at the board. And if they're giving me certain things or they're asking certain things, I always look at the board and the board before. Because that's going to give me an indication of their intentionality, of their accountability to what they actually want to do. And if I don't see that, then at least I know what I'm going into, to be honest with you. At least I know what I'm going into. It's going to be the same thing again. But at least I can ask questions. So I don't know if that answered some of your questions, Daniel. Okay.
Anybody else?
I think going back to our breakout session, we didn't talk about engaging youth directly, but engaging more of the creators of pop culture that will then appeal more to the youth, or whose job it is to create materials that apply or interest the youth more. So I don't think that we should put all of this on ourselves. There's a large community of creators out there that know how to do this well and do it professionally. And so it's not up to us as an individual organization, not to say that we shouldn't be interested or care about that, but I don't think we need to be the ones doing all this ourselves either. It's important to remember there's a whole community of pop culture, creators that are influencers, if you will. Yeah.
Yeah, we've got to break down our silos though, right? We've got to be welcoming
Yeah.
to those people.
Yes, we need to welcome them and work with them, but we don't need to create new silos by trying to do it ourselves.
Another virtual question, Dan? Amy, go ahead.
Howdy. Armand with Gulf Reach Institute. I'm a co-director for youth engagement. I think in our breakout session, something that was really important in Sarada, you were talking about it earlier, you wanted me to expand a little bit. So it's more of a comment than a question afterwards. When some of us in this community hear words like pop culture, youth engagement, novel collaborations and partnerships, it's a little scary because you've never done it before. But you as an organization, you want to get involved in that capacity. You want to serve the underserved because your organization may not have been doing that before. And so in our breakout session, something that kept coming up, and even in the reception last night, was this idea of being comfortable with being uncomfortable. Because if we're talking about, innovation. Innovation happens in the spaces where we're not familiar with. Those are where the big ideas come from, the big dreams and the collaborations. Anyways, so I think my question to the everyone here is, what does it mean when someone says, we don't necessarily need to reinvent the wheel? There are specialists out there that already are doing youth engagement. You as an organization don't necessarily have to create a development process if there already are local organizations or people doing that. So what does it mean when we say, don't invent the wheel, hire a specialist?
I'm sitting up here and I will be the very first person to admit this is not my specialty. I work more with the scientists and the data. So to me, it's hiring and working with your communications or outreach department that are amazing and know how to do this. And same kind of thing, reaching out to the, if there's an audience you're trying to reach out to those people that have the expertise to reach those communities or those audiences. I think reinventing the wheel is like sitting in a room being like, I don't know what to do. Who should I call? Maybe let's try this, but we're not sure. People have spent lots of resources, figuring that out. And I think there's no shame in calling them up or hiring them or partnering with them. It's okay. Just like we talked about building on each other's strengths, I think it's perfectly okay to know when something's not your strength and to partner with others who are.
I think it's good to know when something is not your strength. I also think that if we're going to be engaging people or groups, or right, take the example of like, if you want to do youth engagement, but there's a local community group or another group that does that work, talk to that group and don't just talk to them and pick their brain. It's not about picking their brain, right? You want to talk to them and hire them, put them on contract to do the work with you, because what I think continues to put us in the same situations over and over again is when we're trying to, like learn from what someone else has done and take that away from them and then say like, oh, I did this. Like, no, we need to use what their skills are, their expertise, and their expertise and their knowledge might be different than, or the way that it's displayed or presented might be different than what you typically see. So you might not like at first think that it relates, but it does. And the only one example that I can give is that I hosted, this is completely outside of what I do for my regular job, but I hosted an event, a marine science event for young girls. And there was a young lady who reached out to me and said she wanted to participate, but she's really into music. She's a musical artist, right? But she really likes marine science and she has no idea about how she's going to do both. Like she talked a lot with me about this. Like, I don't really see the intersection. What do I do? And I had asked her to lead like a station where the younger kids would rotate through and learn about different topics. And so she came up with a plan where the kids would take trash and upcycle those trash items to make instruments, and then they would make a song, right? Like crazy, right? And the kids were so excited, right? They learned about items that could be recycled, that should be discarded, ways that they can reuse it. And it was also really empowering for that young woman who had graduated from high school, who is in community college now. She's still trying to figure out what she wants to do, but she knows that she can use her ideas and be creative and create her own path. Like there may not be a path that's out there already. And I'm just bringing it up to say that we might not always recognize, right? Like, that there are opportunities that I think overlap with what our like expertise or the subject matter or the field that we're trying to move forward in. But other people can see things differently than you can. And that might really reach them in a way that what I was going to do, whatever it was, wasn't going to reach them. I think that that's really valuable to give people the space to do that,
We're out of time.
Yeah.
We could have really productive conversations about this for a while. But let's thank our co-leads. And you other co-leads, you get ready because we have not seen the last breakout reporting session. This is only the first of 3. Thank you all very much. And I'll turn it back over to Alan.